Coal is directly putting inflationary pressure on U.S. electricity consumers.
Forcing them to stay online past their planned retirement dates has already cost consumers about $220 million.
What makes this moment feel different for coal, and why has this new narrative of quote-unquote revival?
Data center demand is feeding into it. It's driving the narrative that we need more power. But unfortunately, these plants are old, expensive, and not as reliable as they used to be.
Renewables in general, they all have sort of a role to play in our generation mix of the future. Could you make the case for coal?
Clean energy sources have really just taken over the majority of our grid's generation. And if you're thinking about how do we meet surging demand, here you go. There's something that's cheap and it's quick to build.
Hey everyone, and welcome to Power Perspectives. I'm Kinsey Grant Baker. Coal has always been a compelling story. A fabled industry, a generational shift, a fight to participate in the future. But lately, the story on coal has been shifting significantly. The days of coal as a bygone technology have given way to coal as the recipient of widespread attention, care of the Trump administration's efforts toward energy dominance. Put simply, the Trump White House has picked a favorite child, and that favorite child is apparently coal. But let me break down why that feels a little surprising. Between 2010 and 2019, some 290 coal power plants representing 40% of the U.S. coal generating capacity closed. Largely because renewables got cheaper, fracking got better. Overall, coal plants now produce less than a fifth of our nation's power. But since President Trump took office for the second time and declared an energy emergency, dozens of coal-fired power plants have been kept online past their planned retirements. And only a few weeks ago, President Trump, 1, ordered the Defense Department to purchase electricity from coal-fired power plants, and 2, announced the Energy Department will provide 6 coal plants in Kentucky, North Carolina, Ohio, Virginia, and West Virginia with $175 million for upgrades. So what happens to the rest of the 100 or so coal plants with a combined capacity of 31.5 gigawatts that are set to retire by the end of Trump's term? And do the numbers tell a different story about coal that maybe we're not paying close enough attention to? That's what we are covering today, the unlikely potential comeback of coal and whether it's got real legs. I'm excited to welcome 2 experts from the nonpartisan energy and climate policy think tank Energy Innovation, Silvio Marcacci, Senior Director of Communications, and Michelle Soloman, Manager in the Electricity Program. Michelle, Silvio, welcome to Power Perspectives. How are you today?
Doing great. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks so much, Kinsey.
Of course. I'm excited for this conversation. This is something we write about a lot in our newsletter. It's something people talk about a lot on the Energy Central platform. So I'm eager to dig in and have the full conversation here on Power Perspective. So I want to start with a relatively big question here. We're going to dig right in. If you don't mind, can you both tell me why you think coal kind of became the dominant story in energy over this last year or so? What makes this moment feel different for coal, and why has this new narrative of quote unquote revival really persisted over the last year or so?
Well, I think the Secretary of Energy encapsulated perfectly why coal has been a dominant story in the last 14 months when he said this administration's policy is going to be to stop the closure of coal plants. That's the exact opposite of what utilities, states, and local governments have been working on for the past decade. They've been transitioning off coal because it's dirty, expensive, and unreliable. So, when the U.S. Department of Energy spends billions of taxpayer dollars subsidizing plants or taking away the rights of states by forcing plants to stay online past their planned retirements, or as you mentioned, when the Department of Defense is ordered to buy coal-fired electricity to power military bases, it's got to make news because it's so contrary to the economic reality that investors and utilities have been living in for the past 2 decades.
Yeah, and I'll just add that another reason why this moment is a little bit different and perhaps why it's getting so much attention from the administration is that coal plants are really at the point where they're reaching the end of their lives right now. The average coal plant in the United States is, I think, around 45 years old, and many of them are over 50, even 60 years old. So because they're so old and expensive, utilities and their regulators have been making plans for a long time to close down a lot of these coal plants. So that's kind of like why there's this decision-making point right now. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I guess, planned retirements are long-term, heavily litigated determinations planned for over a decade. So this trend has been building for a long time. I think also data center demand is feeding into it. It's driving the narrative that we need more power, which sounds rhetorically correct, but unfortunately, nothing can really change the fact that these plants are old, expensive, and not as reliable as they used to be. So
Yeah, and putting this sort of reality of coal at odds with some of the headlines that we're seeing, this, continued investment, continued headlines about retirement pushed off 90 days and then another 90 days and then another 90 days. This kind of seems at odds, when we're talking about the headlines versus the reality. All of these plants being kept online past their planned retirements, I think sets us up for an interesting sort of new reality or new context to understand when we're looking at the broader generation picture in the US. So, can you tell me a little bit at the high level how coal fits into that sort of generation reality in our modern context? What role does coal play, and has that role changed at all because of these headlines that we have seen about keeping these plants online?
yeah, I was just going to say that coal's role in our electricity system has shifted a lot over the last 25 years or so. In the early to mid 2000s, coal was generating over 50% of our electricity generation, which is kind of when coal generation peaked in this country. And since then, we've seen the rise of a lot more cheaper types of electricity generation, including natural gas, but now solar, wind, batteries that are all economically outcompeting coal. And so, because they're economically outcompeting coal generation has been declining as a share of our electricity. So now it's down to around 15, 16% of our electricity generation. And the percentage of time that these coal plants are running is much decreased. So we're using them more as like peaker power plants. And things like that. And we are still using them for that purpose right now. We have a lot of coal left still, and we do rely on it, but it doesn't mean it's the only thing that we can rely on for electricity. And that's why we're seeing it start to phase out because there are cheaper options to supply what we need.
Clean energy sources have really just taken over the majority of our grid's generation. And, we're not just talking about renewables, we're talking about things like nuclear, of course, things like gas. But if you look at the sheer data, solar and storage are dominating new generation additions across the country. The Energy Information Administration forecasts more than 99% of new capacity that's going to come online in 2026 will be renewables or batteries. That's up from more than 90% of new capacity added in 2025. And the reason for this is simple. They're the cheapest source of new power. They can be brought online faster than anything else, as quickly as 6 months for solar and storage. And if you're thinking about how do we meet surging demand, well, here you go. There's something that's cheap and it's quick to build.
With this in mind, the fact of the matter being that solar, wind, batteries, renewables in general, even natural gas, that they all have sort of a role to play in our generation mix of the future, some more dominant than others. Could you make the case for coal? I'd be curious to kind of hear both of you try to put yourself in the position of some of these advocates who are pro coal. What is the core part of their argument that seems the loudest or perhaps most resonant?
I mean, I think one part of the argument that is true right now is that we are using coal and we are relying on coal right now because it is such, we still have a lot of it. And of course, we're going to be using the resources that we have on the grid today. But that doesn't mean that they're the best, most reliable, or most affordable resources. So I think that's the important thing to remember is that while coal seems like it's a reliable resource right now because there's this idea that the resources that you can turn on or off at any moment are the most reliable. There's actually a lot more that goes into reliability, including what we call operational reliability or the performance of plants when they're actually online. And so what we see with coal right now is that unfortunately, because these plants are so old, because they're having so many maintenance issues, they have the highest forced outage rate of any type of power generation in the country, and it's been rising over the last several years. So when we look at what resources we can actually rely on when we need them, it's actually not coal, even though rhetorically, again, it sounds like it could be coal.
Yeah, I mean, again, let's let the numbers speak for themselves. The North American Electric Reliability Corporation, which is a independent entity that assesses the reliability of the grid as a whole, and has been their reports have been used. Their reports that we're facing a supply crunch that's been used to make the case that we need to burn more coal. Their own data shows coal plants break down more frequently than gas, hydropower, or nuclear generation. That's what Michelle was talking about. They have an average unplanned outage rate of 11%. That's from 2020 to 2023, and that's up from 8% between 2014 and 2017. So again, these plants are becoming more unreliable the older they get. Uh, and third-party analysis of NERC data shows coal has the highest equipment-related outage rate. That's how often a generator is broken down due to a mechanical issue. And let me just say I am within that 45 to 50-year-old range, and I can certainly attest to the fact that things kind of break down more often than they used to, and it's harder to bounce back. And so, you're looking at something that it's an old technology. No one's building coal anymore. As they break down, they become less and less reliable, especially in extreme weather, extreme cold, extreme heat.
Yeah, and that's been a huge part of the conversation, I would say, at least more recently. In the US, we're having this conversation in the end of February. We recently had a lot of very extreme weather here in the US where it was very, very cold, very, very snowy, very, very icy across large swaths of our country. That seemed to be, positioned in some ways as a bit of a feather in the cap of coal, that coal can step in when perhaps solar and wind can't in those moments of extreme weather, for example. So it sounds like you're saying, Silvio, that potentially that's not the case, yeah?
Coal does not perform well in extreme weather. Period, point blank. I mean, sure, you did see an increased burn during Winter Storm Fern, but Michelle and another member of our team broke down the data in PJM, and there were coal outages on the biggest day of the storm. And let's talk about this. So coal plants become quite brittle in cold weather because it kind of hits coal plants at the heart of their reliability claim, which is fuel on hand. There's multiple examples of large coal piles at plants freezing, which means the coal can't be burned or it can clog the machines that bring the coal into the plant. So that happened in the eastern US, where wide scale cold outages happened during 2022's Winter Storm Elliott. Certainly, coal plants led to historic blackouts in Texas's 2021 Winter Storm Uri, as well as a wide-scale Texas blackout in 2011. Those are environmentalists saying that these are government entities doing breakdowns of what happened. So all those mechanisms that supply water to the plant can freeze during truly extreme cold weather. Um, and then, because coal is a large centralized resource, not distributed, not small scale, if one of these big plants goes down, that impact is magnified, whereas smaller distributed resources can add big value during these extreme events. And, it's not just coal. It is also extreme heat. The reason why is because coal plants need water to cool themselves down and create steam. And the stress of burning coal at full throttle when the air outside is already extremely hot often causes mechanical breakdowns, especially at these really older clunker plants. Water is even more of an issue for plants that use river water for cooling because that water can become hotter than the plant needs, or drought can reduce the amount of water they can suck up. We saw this definitely during Australia's 2024 extreme heat wave. Multiple coal plants broke down. Happened in Texas as recently as 2022 and 2025. In fact, that 2025 heat wave was what forced Sandy Creek, which is America's newest coal plant, to break down. It's going to be broken down until at least this year. And I was looking recently, researchers in Europe found coal is the most vulnerable fossil fuel technology to extreme heat. So, again, you're talking about something that, if conditions aren't right, breaks down.
Not to extend this answer for too long, but just to add a little bit on how other resources like wind, solar, and batteries can step up in these types of situations. One thing that we saw during the recent Winter Storm Fern, when there were fossil outages, is that solar and wind actually performed really well, even though it was winter. The renewables still showed up. They're a small part of the electric grid in the Northeast where the storm hit really hard. So they weren't providing as big of a percentage of generation. But what we saw is that during the actual snowstorm, the wind energy picked up because it was windy and the wind performed really well. And then as the storm abated, solar came back online really quickly because um, snow actually doesn't stay on solar panels very well. They tend to be angled. The snow tends to fall off. Solar panels are black, so the snow melts really quickly. So right after the storm, the solar picked back up again. So you can see the potential there and how well these resources can contribute to reliability if you bring them online.
Yeah, it's really rich context, I think, to add to this conversation about reliability, knowing that reliability really is one of the three big words when we're talking about things that really matter to utility professionals. It's resilience, reliability, and Affordability is the last one. So I feel we've really covered, reliability and have a good picture of how that factors into this conversation about coal. But let's talk about affordability. I would love to hear a little bit more about, the operational expenses that might be attached to number one, just coal as an input, but number two, coal as something that is, continuing to be invested in even past retirement age when these plants are aging and sort of past their prime. How does the cost factor into the conversation about the future of coal in this country?
So, our recent research found that the cost of electricity generated by coal increased 28% between 2021 and 2024. That 28% increase was almost double the rate of inflation increase during that time, which was around 16%, which means that coal is directly putting inflationary pressure on US electricity consumers. So I think that's the first thing to remember. The cost increases were largely attributed to the cost of physical coal fuel itself going up. There's a few different reasons for that. One being the spike in fossil fuel costs during the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and then just not falling back down to the same levels. Coal itself also has some specific reasons why it's more expensive. A lot of the coal that's mined in the Appalachian region is getting more and more expensive because A, the rocks are more difficult to mine, and also a lot of the most easily accessed coal has now been used. So we're going deeper, it's getting more expensive, there's less of it, and things like that. And then as coal plants retire, your coal supply chain becomes less and less robust, harder and harder for plants to get coal, becomes more and more expensive in that way.
Yeah, and I think you know, there's two ways to look at cost. One is, once a coal plant is once the utilities and the regulators decide that they can retire a coal plant because it's too expensive or it's not worth, keeping online anymore. They do it does create this extremely disruptive cycle to then pull them out of that retirement planning process. Because once they begin this retirement process, the plant runs less frequency. They start to defer maintenance. The challenges of operating that plant increase as it might need to run more flexibly. Resources to run the plant, like materials or staff, decrease. So when they're ordered to stay open, they have to work through some of these deferred maintenance projects, and some of them are going to need to be addressed at high costs. Like that happened in Colorado, where we both live. One of the plants that was forced to stay open was the Craig Power Plant. It was broken down when they said it was going to have to come back online, and that cost millions of dollars. But the other thing is that, as Michelle said, the cost of buying coal, right? So once a plant decides to shut down, the utility stops buying coal in long-term contracts, which are cheaper, and it starts to buy its coal by hedging on spot markets. So the actual supply of coal isn't guaranteed. The cost of buying that coal in short-term contracts can be higher than normal if they can even get it. And so, there's two sides to this. The other side is, well, what happens with these plants that have been forced to stay online? And as you mentioned, there have been so far 5 coal plants that have been forced to stay online, starting in Michigan. Then there were 2 in Indiana, 1 in Colorado, 1 in Washington State. Uh, Forcing them to stay online past their planned retirement dates has already cost consumers about $220 million. That's mainly the Michigan plant because it's been extended several times. But if those 202C orders are applied to force additional plants to stay open that are already scheduled to close, that price could balloon to between $3 and $6 billion a year, depending on how many plants are forced online. And it's unacceptable because household electricity costs already rose 13% in 2025. And I think it's something like 1 in 6 households, 1 in 20 households in the United States, 6 million households, have utility bills so high that they're going to be sent to collections. And so you cannot add more cost pressure onto people's bills, onto families' bills, onto businesses' bills when they're already struggling. And again, I want to come back to this is not just like environmentalists saying this. There's this great blog by the conservative think tank R Street called Zombie Power Plants Are Eating Competitive Power Markets. And that's what happens when you put these power plants that are no longer economically competitive and you're forcing them to run in a power plant, in a power market that throws off the entire balance of that market, which operates on economics to decide what to dispatch.
Yeah, I mean, this is all really, really interesting, I think, to have in the same conversation, right? We're talking about the economic viability, we're talking about the reliability impacts of coal. All of this seems to make a lot of sense, especially when we're comparing coal to other generation sources. But I'm wondering if consumers understand this, to your point that this is actively contributing to an increase in their bills. Do you think that there is an understanding among average everyday sort of end users of power that coal is part of that?
I think it's extremely tricky for the average person to understand even what's on their power bill, let alone what contributes to that cost. I think it's a far easier proposition to understand the link between gasoline prices and the price of driving. I think if you are someone who has installed solar on their roof, I did that last year, uh, you quickly become very attuned to what your utility bill is comprised of. But I think for the average person who is really just focused on, what's going on in their lives, their job, their kids, it's a step harder to ask them to consider what exactly is causing their bills to go up.
Yeah, when you get your power bill, there are different line items, right? There's cost of generation, there's cost of transmission, there's cost of distribution, et cetera. But oftentimes because our electric grid is made up of a lot of different resources, the impacts of fossil fuel price volatility don't really come through directly on your electricity bill. They're obscured by a lot of other things. And so, to the example of like when you buy gas at the gas pump, you see the price of gas and how you're paying more one day and less another day because that fossil fuel is really volatile. But that's something that's a lot harder to see on your electricity bill. And I think is something really important to keep educating people about, that this is one of the reasons why costs are going up so much, not only for the cost of coal fuel, but also the cost of gas fuel, and why having fuel free resources like wind and solar that are free once they're built can really help us avoid exposure to the risk of fossil fuel price volatility and the fact that it can lead to really big spikes in our bills, especially in winter.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is Energy Central is not just for energy professionals. Everybody should be listening to this. This is a conversation that, impacts us all. It's compelling. It's interesting to think about also how those utilities tell that story to consumers, which brings me to the question of what utilities think about all of this. From your understanding and your work in the industry, I'm curious if you have any perspective on how utility professionals, how decision makers, how people working at electric utilities sort of perceive these orders to keep the plants online, or these conversations about coal in terms of quote unquote energy dominance. What are they saying? What are their thoughts on coal right now?
I can't speak directly for the specific people that are working on these things, but I think overall what we're seeing is that it's really, really disruptive for utility planning. And it's making the lives of utility planners much harder. So, as we mentioned before, the process to retire a coal plant is a years, decade long process litigated in the Public Utilities Commission. Replacement resources are secured. They do all of this planning in advance to make sure that when a plant closes down, both the grid and the community are ready. So when you then get a 90-day order issued on the day that the plant is about to retire to extend its life for 90 days, um, that just like totally throws everything on its head. Silvio mentioned this already about how when a plant is preparing to retire, they defer maintenance, they stop buying coal, workers leave. So keeping that plant online then becomes more expensive than it was to just run the plant when it, was already when it was running previously already. So I think it's pretty clear that this is very disruptive, and we've seen it also in the actions that utilities and states have taken in response to some of these emergency orders, with attorneys general taking action to actually go into litigation with the administration to continue forward with their plans. We've seen it with communication from the utility in Colorado that they actually see this as an illegal taking because they're having to put money into the plant that they wouldn't have had to otherwise. Um, so I think, yeah, all in all, really disruptive.
Yeah, I mean, to put a finer point on what Michelle just said, 16 states and that one utility that whose coal plant was forced to stay open are suing the federal government, saying the 202C orders are unconstitutional. Right? That is the utility themselves speaking. We also saw something similar in MISO, where the utility stakeholders asked MISO to figure out how to allocate these costs across the grid. So they're saying, we need you to let us know how to allocate these costs because these are unexpected costs. And, also going back to the whole thing about grid reliability, um, grid operators struggle with reliability planning as a part of these plants being forced to stay back online because they need to know when the retirement's going to happen. They need to know when new power plants can come online, and their market rules can't just change unnecessarily. So plants that jumping back and forth from retired to order to run to maybe extended in 90-day increments doesn't fit into those long run reliability plans.
Yeah, I mean, it is certainly, I have said on this show before and will repeat until I'm blue in the face, making these, future-oriented forecasts and using the crystal ball is, like, not a job I am envious of, but I imagine that, even at its easiest, it's made a lot more difficult when we have all of these different kinds of inputs in terms of orders and lawsuits and, complaints and all of that. Which sort of brings me to, I think, really what is the ultimate sort of thesis question of this conversation. If coal is disruptive for utility planning, more expensive for consumers, not as reliable as other sources, has the highest forced outage rate, why has the Trump administration, in your view, really seized on to coal as part of the energy dominance narrative? What makes coal the thing that they want to push right now?
I'm not going to engage in conjecture about the administration's reasons for doing things, but I will say that if you are not listening to the utilities and the state regulators and the grid operators who know how to run their own grid and know how to run their power plants and do so reliably, I think that's a disconnect with what folks in the energy industry know.
So, with all of this conversation in mind, the realities of operating in a utility industry that has to reckon with some of these, coal headlines and the sort of orders coming from the Trump administration in the White House today. I would love if you could just help us to look ahead a little bit and think about what, coal looks like as a share of generation, as a, potential reality of the US energy, power mix. What does that look like in let's say 5 to 10 years? Can you give us a little bit of a glimpse into the future of coal?
Yeah, I can give a little bit of a glimpse, recognizing that, things are changing all the time and we don't know exactly what will happen. But as it stands, I think over half of the existing coal fleet is still expected to retire by 2035. So long term, we're going to continue to see coal use decrease in the US. I think you're going to see not only the coal plants continuing to retire, but also the percentage at which those plants are run for the ones that remain online will continue to decrease as well, just again, due to the operational costs of coal. There have been some retirements that are delayed. I think recent research from the Global Energy Monitor found somewhere around maybe 25 gigawatts have been kind of delayed for retirements, but still those delays in retirements are only on average 2 to 4 years. So the long-term trajectory really remains the same for coal.
Yeah, I mean, no one's building more coal plants, right? And so you've got this limited set of generation that is old, that breaks down, and you're applying an order. So Section 202C under the Emergency Power Act is being applied here to keep them online. Traditionally, this has only been used in times of war or extreme weather disasters where you need to run things. And now what you have instead is them being extended 90 days, extended 90 days. You've already seen lawsuits. And so who knows how those are going to play out. But I think if you're talking about the growth of the industry, you'd be hard pressed to say the industry will grow, right? They're at 15%. Maybe there's a little variance on either side there. But to Michelle's point, they're going to continue getting older. And, honestly, this is one of the most ironic things I thought about that recent order for the Department of Defense to run coal power. You're talking about some of the most critical infrastructure in America, and you're telling it you have to depend on a 45-year-old power plant, which is extremely prone to breaking down. And to me, that's like telling soldiers who are about to deploy into a battle that they need to drive in an 81 Chrysler LeBaron instead of some modern warfighting vehicle. And, I wonder if as these plants continue to break down and there are issues, if it becomes more of an energy security discussion than it is now.
Yeah. I mean, That sounds like an entirely other podcast conversation for us to have. We're gonna have to write that one down to come back to because it is one of the big buzzwords in our industry right now is security, ensuring security and the many shapes it takes. Right, we're not just talking about physical security, cybersecurity. We're talking about firm load and what that looks like from a security perspective. So certainly very interesting, Sylvia. I'm curious to see how that sort of plays out. And my final question, you mentioned at the beginning that part of why coal has taken up a increasingly smaller share of the overall power mix in the US is, partly because of economics and partly because of just the way that a competitive power market works. But also that we're still using a little coal because we've got a little coal left to use. So can we put a timeline on that? What is sort of the timeline for using that up? Is that resource sort of baseline growing in any way, shape, or form? And finally, what replaces that when we look to the future of what the power mix looks like here?
Yeah, I think it's hard to say. It's hard to put an exact time frame on this year. Coal will no longer be running, but I think just the point stands that we're going to continue to see a decreasing share. And then as for what replaces it, there's no one size fits all energy mix that works everywhere all the time. There's different ones that work in different geographies and in different conditions. So, but overall, what you want to see is a highly diversified set of resources that can work well together to meet the needs at all hours of the day and year. So, that can be any combination of things. I think the cheapest resources that we can build now are wind, solar, and batteries. And so that's going to make up the lion's share of our electricity mix moving forward because that's what's going to be best for consumers. And then you're probably going to have a small percentage of something that can make up the last little bit when you have less renewable output. Or for seasonal variation. So the jury's kind of out on exactly what that set of technologies will be that will fit that last 10% of our electricity system. There's some options such as nuclear, geothermal. If we can get carbon capture technology to be much, much better and much more economically viable than it is now, that could be an option on gas plants. It could be an option on coal plants, but given the fact that coal plants are retiring and old, it's not making a lot of sense. It's not looking like it makes a lot of sense to retrofit coal plants with carbon capture long term.
Yeah, I mean, I think unfortunately there has been a pushback on offshore wind as a resource. You know, some of the other countries in this world that we consider our economic competitors, like China, like the European Union, they are leaning into offshore wind and they are building it in massive quantities. And you get these sustained winds offshore with these large capacity turbines that generate wind at night, that generate wind during storms. There was some data out showing the cost savings that PJM and the New York ICO and New England ICO could have seen uh, if offshore wind had been built out to the degree that it was. Now, who knows what's going to happen with supply chains? There's a lot of legal challenges which the offshore wind industry has been winning. But, maybe at some point in the future, that's a technology that we come back to because, that is a resource that is optimal for meeting demand in these very constrained areas with high prices that you can't build new generation and you can't build new transmission into. And so, it kind of feels like you're leaving some points on the board if you're not thinking about offshore wind as part of that diverse mix that Michelle mentioned, which includes things like nuclear and gas and batteries and all these other things. I mean, it really does take a diverse portfolio to meet the energy demands of our modern time.
Absolutely. I think that has been one of the biggest learnings of my time in this industry is that there is no one size fits all approach. We have to take, many different realities, many different challenges, many different opportunities into account to build this power system of the future that we need. So, Silvio, Michelle, thank you so much for walking me through all of this. I learned a ton. I wrote down a ton in my notebook, and we have many more conversations that this really opened the door to. So I appreciate you sharing all of this with me. And if you're down, we can now do our quick lightning round to end us here with a little momentum. We'll keep things rapid fire. So, quick answers. Let's keep it to a couple words, sentence or two, if you don't mind.
Sure.
All right. Let's do it. So, my first question for both of you, do you have a prediction on what maybe one of the next big energy headlines is going to be? Or perhaps something people aren't talking enough about?
I think it's going to be gas prices. EIA has forecast gas prices are going to rise 33% this year. They rose 60% from 2024 to 2025. A lot of that's driven by LNG exports. Right now, gas composes 40% of our energy supply. So any higher commodity prices there pushes up overall bills. Obviously, affordability is the buzzword, and seems like gas is one of the favorite technologies right now. So I think it's going to become a bigger story.
Yeah, for my headline that I think that not enough people are talking about, I'm gonna go with distributed energy resources and the potential to help reduce energy bills for people in their homes, and also providing resilience. As we have this increased extreme weather due to climate change, resilience is becoming more and more important for people. And I think it's driving them to install solar and batteries in a on top of just the energy cost savings. So I think that the additional investments people are making in these technologies and what that means for how we can better optimize the grid, both on the distribution system and on the transmission system, is going to be a really interesting thing to follow because it has big cost savings potential for everyone, not just the people who are installing those technologies.
Yeah, really interesting. I like it. You've been DER pilled, as they call it in the biz. So, my next question for you, do you have any reading recommendations for our listeners? Any books, long reads, people, anything that they should check out?
Yeah, I'm gonna go with a fiction one on this one. My reading recommendation is Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver. Just really incredible book that has a lot of tough things happening, but still manages to maintain a tone of hope that I just really enjoyed. So,
Yeah, I
it's my
I would have to second that times a million. It's one of my probably top 5 books of all time, and also fitting to talk about Demon Copperhead, which takes place in Appalachia, in a conversation when we're talking about coal, the certain parts of the country that get left behind. Lots of overlap there. I like it. Okay, and Sylvia, what about you?
I also agree with Demon Copperhead. When Michelle and I were chatting about books, I said, "Oh, great book." I'm going to go in a little bit of different direction. I also am a big fiction reader. I almost exclusively read fiction. I read a book late last year called "The Immortal King Rao" by a woman who's a former Wall Street Journal tech reporter named Vahini Vara. I hope I pronounced that correctly. But it's basically like the main character, King Rao. He's not a king. That's his name, King Rao. He is a man born in India in a very low class, and he creates this new kind of computer. It's basically like he becomes an amalgam of Steve Jobs and Bill Gates, and eventually he becomes, the most powerful person in the world. And the story is then told from the perspective of his daughter, who was conceived like when he was like 100, right? So immortal, he lives a long time. And it's told from her perspective of trying to understand what brought him to this place. He eventually becomes exiled from society because people think he's going too far. And it all takes place in like sort of a hothouse Earth scenario, a near future where climate change has gotten out of control. And so it's like that's the little subtext of it, but it's also this larger context of like, what does technology mean for our lives? What goes too far? Fascinating book.
Yeah, that sounds incredible. I'm gonna add that one to the list. It sounds like a really, really interesting premise, especially in like gestures to everything these times that we're living in. So my final question for you, what are you hoping will be the legacy of your career?
This is a very thoughtful question. Thank you for answering it. And I think both of us sort of thought deeply about what it meant. I'm 20 years into my career in climate policy, and in thinking about this, I sort of recalled back to when I first got into this line of work. I thought, "Wow, I'm going to be the generation that solves it. We're going to stop climate change." And as I've progressed and learned more about the science and the inertia in the system, the not only what's in our atmosphere, but also the inertia in the energy transition, my orientation has sort of changed. And I think at this point in my career, I realize that I'm just a link in the chain. My generation will not solve climate change. And I think I want the legacy of my career to be enabling the next generation of folks working climate change, like my friend Michelle here, to help them do better and to help them succeed and help them carry on the mission.
I love it. And Michelle?
Yeah, so I work in electricity policy, which is a very wonky area, and sometimes gets really technical on how the grid works, AC, power flow, whatever. But for me, it's really about the people. And so for me, the thing that motivates me in my career is helping find and develop the solutions that help communities thrive as we work towards a future grid that is clean, safe, and reliable. So that's what I hope my legacy can be, is helping find those solutions that are right for communities.
Absolutely. I think those are two really, really wonderful and strong sentiments to end this conversation on. So much of our work on this show is how do we want to leave the world a little better than we found it? What does the future look like? How can we help build it in a way that makes sense for everybody? So I appreciate you both sharing both of those wonderful insights. So that's it. We have come to the end of our conversation here. I again have learned so much from both of you and really really appreciate you joining us here on Power Perspectives. This was a wonderful conversation and I'm excited to keep it rolling.
Yeah.
Thank
Thanks so
thank
much
you
for
again.
having
Appreciate it.
Of course. Of course. And thank you to all of our listeners for tuning in once again to Power Perspectives. I'm Kinsey Grant Baker and I will see you next time.